Hi, everyone, and welcome to Leaders in Lowell's virtual discussion series. Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Deborah Lee James. Secretary James, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Daniel.
So you served in both government and business in a variety of capacities. Could you give us kind of an overview of your very distinguished career?
Yes, well, I am about a 37-year veteran of the national security community. About 20 years of that 37 years has been in the government in a variety of areas, and I have been in and out of the government over the course of my career. About 10 years I spent much earlier in my life on Capitol Hill as a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee, which, as you know, is one of the 4 committees in Congress that reviews and approves the defense budget and defense policy. And then I've had 2 tours of duty in the Pentagon as a senior official. The first time in the Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs. That's the portfolio of our National Guard and Reserve forces across America and their role in the total force. And then the second time, most recently, I was the Secretary of the Air Force, which I will say was the honor and privilege of my professional life. The balance of my career, about 17 years, I have spent in the private sector, but the thread that has always linked my jobs together has been national security, as I said earlier. A variety of jobs in the private sector, but key among them, I was about 12 years with a company called SAIC, which is a member of the Fortune 500. It's technology, services, and solutions primarily for the federal government, and a large piece of their business, this was my sweet spot, was for the Defense Department. So I had a variety of jobs there, including leading as president one of the major segments of the company. So I did have that P&L experience. And for the last 3 years, I have been serving on boards of directors of a variety of companies, as well as mentoring, as well as I wrote a book called Aim High, Chart Your Course, and Find Success. So that's about a 3-minute overview of 37 years of my life.
So how did you get into, national defense and stuff like that? Did you figure out in college kind of what you wanted to do? And how did you come to that in your career path?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question with a story full of twists and turns. So let me explain. And I also want to congratulate you, Bridget, and you, Daniel, for putting together Leaders in Lowell to begin with. I think it is remarkable, and I congratulate you as 2 high school seniors who took the initiative, who had the persistence, the dedication, and you're carrying forward with this program, even in the virtual world, in view of COVID-19. So congratulations on that. I wasn't nearly as squared away as you are today when I was in high school, but I did have a dream, and that dream in high school was I wanted to be a diplomat, wanted to be in the Foreign Service and ultimately travel the world and represent the foreign policy of the United States in different regions, especially Latin America. I loved Spanish. I had traveled extensively in the region. And throughout high school, college, which for me was Duke University, and graduate school, which was Columbia University, I took all of the courses that I thought would lead me to this destination. So focusing on international affairs, political science, language, etc. Indeed, that was my major, international affairs. I also did a foreign exchange program, so I became fluent in the language that I loved, which was Spanish. I even got, as a graduate student, one of the few solicited internships to actually go to a U.S. embassy. It was in Lima, Peru, for 1 summer, and I worked in the political section. So I even had a little bit of experience as a junior foreign service officer, all as a very young person. I moved to Washington out of grad school, thought I had everything going my way, applied to the Foreign Service, and of course I wouldn't say promptly because things take a long time in government for you to get an answer sometimes, but I got rejected. I didn't get accepted. And I just remember my whole young life flashing before my eyes at the age of 22 or 23, thinking I was washed up. I had spent all these years with this one dream and it didn't work out. So I had to pivot, you might say, by necessity, because I had to have a job. I couldn't go unemployed. And so I took the only job in the federal government because I applied to every agency you can think of, and I got rejection after rejection. And the only one that offered me an acceptance was the Department of the Army. Now, I had zero interest in military matters back in those days. I had zero exposure to the military as a child growing up, but it was a job, and having that job was important to me. So I threw myself into it, I accepted it, and I did the best that I could do. But about 3 or 4 months into it, remarkable things started happening for me. The first thing that happened was, first of all, the issues that I was working on, they were very, very interesting. I had never thought of them before, particularly not in that light, but they were very interesting. The second thing that happened was I felt jazzed by the purpose, by the importance of the work that I was doing. I used to always feel that I would feel bigger than something just myself if I were part of the State Department. And I found that there are other careers, particularly the military, was giving me that same sense of purpose. And I felt really proud of my work. The next thing that happened was I had a great team, really had great camaraderie. I learned from them. They accepted me, took me under their wing. And lastly, I had a great first boss and mentor who opened some doors, made some connections. And before you know it, thanks to that original mentor, one job led to the next job led to the next, and so on and so forth. And 37 years somehow went by. And here I am, not having really looked back toward the State Department. I could have reapplied. It sometimes makes sense to follow that original dream. But what I discovered is there are multiple ways to realize your dreams. And there's multiple things that interest or can interest all of us if you just open up your eyes. So no, I did not ever aspire to be the Secretary of the Air Force. I did not aspire for a career in the military. It was all due to a pivot, due to something that felt like a terrible failure way back when. But that was another good first lesson for me, that you can learn a lot from failures. And when one door closes, always, always another door will open. You just have to be able to recognize it, take a risk, walk through that door and try something new.
So we often think that kind of the fields of national defense and military are male-dominated fields. Do you think there was anything in your career did you realize that while you were working with the Pentagon and throughout your career? And do you think anything was different because of gender kind of throughout your life?
There's no question that the military still today is a very male-dominated institution. The world of national security, even among civilians, is still a very male-dominated institution. Now, there are way more women in it, flash forward 35, 37 years later, than when I started. So I became accustomed at a young age to being either the only or among the few women at the table. And keep in mind, all of us, when we're brand new starting out in our career, and at least for me, it was the first 10, 12 years of my career, I was always an individual contributor. I was not in a leadership capacity directly right out of school. So again, I was used to being one of the few women who were the individual contributors in the environment. I can honestly say nothing really bad ever happened to me. I never felt direct discrimination because I was a woman. I've certainly had, I guess, my fair share of being in environments where there were inappropriate jokes or inappropriate comments being made, but it was never anything that felt so devastating to me that I felt like I couldn't carry on and I couldn't deal with it one-on-one. Probably a bigger challenge for me, and I think this could be something particularly your viewers will say resonates with them. I was always the youngest among many, many older people for years. And so if I felt self-conscious about anything or felt like I didn't particularly fit in for a particular reason, it was because of age diversity, not so much because of gender diversity. And of course, note to self, that eventually evaporates over time. So needless to say, I'm not the youngest one at the table anymore, but I used to feel that I had to work harder, study more, be better, just to prove that, hey, I'm not some young kid. I know my material as well, and I can make a contribution.
So how do you think that that's kind of changing and like getting more younger people involved, more women, more diversity in the armed services? And does that change kind of strengthen U.S. defense, or how are you seeing that impact the Air Force when you were there?
Diversity in the armed forces definitely strengthens the armed forces. Now, keep in mind, there are civilians, like I always was, but then there are the uniformed military. And if you just look at the world of the uniformed military, the vast majority of them are between the ages of 18 and 30. So it is a very young force. The senior leaders, of course, are not in that age category. They are older individuals. And the national security professionals who serve as the civilians are older. But we do have to be used to that very young force. And the number one area where that young force is helping us is in the area of technology, because young people have grown up with some of these key technologies. They have a greater facility for operating the technology than those of us who have learned it in adulthood. So that sort of innovation is crucial. Gender diversity is equally crucial, as is geographic diversity and diversity of background. So, you know, there are many fine areas in the US Air Force. There's the pilots, there's the space, there's cyber. And to the extent you have all of these types of backgrounds at the decision-making table, you are going to come up with more creative, innovative solutions than if you just have everybody being the same.
Right, and definitely in all career fields, that's important now, especially. But kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier too, I think you talk in your book about fighting sexual assault in the Air Force. What did you tackle? What did you do to tackle this issue, and how has it changed since?
Well, I believe, Bridget, that whenever you're dealing with any problem that you're trying to solve, or any issue in your organization where you're at least trying to advance the ball to leave your organization in a better position than the position you found it in, there's basically a 5-step process that we all should go through. And I outline this in my book, Aim High. The first, and I basically used this process when it came to tackling sexual assault and sexual harassment. And I use this same process pretty much in my business life, in my personal life. Again, I think it's repeatable and addressable in any career or even in your home life. So the 5-step process briefly is: number one, investigate, get your facts, know what your data tells you, and don't forget ever that part of investigation is talking to the people who are impacted by whatever the issue is at hand, and people at all levels, not just the top people, people at the ground level as well. After you've investigated, the next step is communicate. The investigation phase hopefully allows you to understand the problem, the extent of the problem, the urgency of the problem. Now you need to build support to do things differently, and that involves communication. So communication, by the way, I always say is step 2, but it's really step 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to infinity. You have to keep doing it throughout. After communicate comes the 3rd step, and that is activate. Okay, we need a series of programs. We need to do things differently. How are we going to address this specifically? Number 4 is iterate, because whatever programs you have come up with in the activate phase, you can be pretty sure you're not going to get it 100% right from the beginning. You're going to need to change things up as you see what works and what doesn't work. If you're the Secretary of the Air Force and you're fighting sexual harassment and assault, you might need to negotiate with Congress. You know, everything in the military, you need to negotiate with Congress. So all of this is part of the iterate phase. And then finally, very importantly, the 5th is follow-up. Because just because you deliver an order, just because you state a vision, it doesn't mean people will understand it, will follow it. You need to constantly follow up on your programs, on your statistics. You need to keep talking to the people. And it needs to be relentless, because nothing happens easily, particularly not when you're talking about a culture change. So this essentially is what we went through on sexual assault. We gathered the statistics. We knew that we had a problem. By the way, all of America has a problem. It's not unique to the military, but we had definitely a problem. And the communicate phase was continual for me. Every time I traveled, every time I testified before Congress, every speech I gave, essentially I would touch on this theme about how we were doing things differently. This was not acceptable. We were going to take action against perpetrators. We were going to look out for our victims in a better way. There were a variety of programs instituted, everything from changing up the way we did training to the way that we cared for victims. Lots of things were changed, some of which didn't work. Then we had to iterate. And of course, new ideas came along that we added in. And during the 3 years that I was Secretary of the Air Force, I tried to pursue that relentless follow-up that I told you about. So again, every base I ever traveled to, I would meet with victims, I would meet with the frontline defenders. They were called SARCs, the Sexual Assault Response Coordinators. So these were the individuals at each base who were on top of the cases and how they were being investigated and how were the victims doing. I would meet privately with them. And of course, I would review the statistics on a monthly basis back in Washington. So that follow-up and letting the force know that the top person responsible for the Air Force was on it was an important communication factor, because if your team knows that you care about something and you're not going to let go, you're going to keep following up, they will much more likely fall into line and follow up as well.
So I would imagine there's no typical day as Secretary of the Air Force, because that's such a big and wide-ranging job. But what do you think were the main things you did every day that really connect? What was the job like every day?
Well, I will tell you, so some days we're in Washington, D.C. Obviously, my home base was the Pentagon. A typical day in Washington, D.C. might involve departing the house around 6:15 in the morning. I would try and get a little bit of personal exercise in before the day would begin, and I would begin the workday in the Pentagon, let's say about 8:30, 9 o'clock. There would be a series of meetings throughout the day about defense policy, about defense budgets. Some would be informational, just so that I would be kept abreast of issues. Lots would be decisional, where I would be called upon to make a decision about a personnel matter, a matter of equipment or weaponry, training, etc. These are the elements of the job. I might have an interface or a congressional hearing where I was testifying, or it might be a private meeting with a senator or congressman on a matter of importance to that individual, or a matter of importance that the Air Force was trying to get through Congress. And then at night, frequently there might be a speech, there might be a group that I was meeting with, so it would be a sort of a public event that might involve a dinner. So the point is, it was a pretty long day, maybe 6 in the morning leaving the house and maybe not getting home some nights until 9 or 10. On the road, which I was probably 40% of the time, it would be quite a different matter. I would be meeting, again, a long day, but I would be meeting with airmen on the front line. I would be meeting with some of the leaders in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, or it could be Europe or the Far East, because I had the privilege of going to 44 different countries while I was Secretary of the Air Force, and understanding the issues on the ground, because of course this is the front line of the Air Force, and my ultimate job is to support them and whatever their issues are, to bring those issues back to Washington and see if I can help solve them or advance the ball.
So what qualities, kind of personally and professionally, do you think made you a successful leader and made your tenure successful while you were with the Air Force?
I think, and again, this is the prescription that I put forth in the book, Aim High. I think there's 3 essential actions that every individual contributor as well as leader needs to take to heart and needs to work on throughout their lives. So the first essential action is chart and navigate your course. So if you're an individual contributor, you need to have your plan A. You heard my plan A was the State Department originally, but be prepared to pivot to a plan B if for any reason plan A doesn't turn out or isn't turning out to be what you hoped it would be. So chart your course and navigate. If you're the leader, of course, you're not just responsible for yourself, you're responsible for helping bring your organization along a vision and how to navigate that vision. So chart and navigate works for both individual contributors and for leaders, and I've tried to live by that. Number 2, it's all about teamwork. You've got to be able to collaborate, you've got to be a contributing member of the team, but you also have to embrace the talents of the entire team and not fear them, not put them down, because you're strong at certain things, but you're not strong at everything, and you need to be self-aware to know what your strengths are and play to those strengths, but also in a team environment. If you're the leader, you got to go a step further. You've got to do everything I just said, but you've also got to inspire that team. Because increasingly in today's world, people don't want to be told just what to do. They want to understand the context. They want to understand the purpose, the higher purpose behind it. This all gets to the issue of inspiration. And that's where it's really important to hone your communication skills as you go up the leadership chain. And then the third thing, which is important, both for individual contributors and leaders, is to get things done. Because after all, isn't that what we're ultimately judged upon? Did we reach the goals? Did we advance the ball for our organization? Did we do better for the people than the circumstances we found when we entered the job? So getting things done is so important, which is why this 5-step process is in the book. I think anybody can tackle any issue if they follow that basic process.
So in your book, you also talk about the nuclear enterprise scandal. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that derailed your plan for the first 100 days and maybe how you used those leadership strategies to deal with it?
Yes, well, when I was a brand new Secretary of the Air Force, I had sort of going in the front door, a 100-day plan. I had a series of travel stops that I wanted to make. I had 3 key initiatives, 3 key goals that I wanted to pursue as Secretary of the Air Force, and my 100-day plan and my travel schedule was keyed into being able to highlight those themes and, you know, do my investigation, the beginning of communications, et cetera, according to the 5-step plan. So I thought, wow, I'm flying high here. This is pretty good for somebody who is 3 weeks old on the job. Well, it was also at about that time, the 3-week point, that everything changed, because it came to my attention that there had been an irregularity in our nuclear enterprise, which, to state the obvious, is the most catastrophic group of weapons that we have in our arsenal. So whenever anything goes slightly wrong in the nuclear enterprise, you really have to be on point. You have to be on it. You have to get to the bottom of it and know what's happening. So essentially, my 100-day plan got ripped up, and instead I focused on this problem. And the problem, by the way, might sound minor. The problem was cheating among some of the airmen who were standing watch over these weapons. And they are delivered many tests to test their competency, and it came to the light that there were dozens at a particular base who had cheated on one of these proficiency exams. So maybe that doesn't sound too bad, but again, the quality of the weapons automatically makes it sound bad. And immediately it called into question for me, wow, well, what if they don't know their jobs? You know, they're cheating to get through a test. Are we going to have an accidental launch? Are we going to have an explosion? To me, it was really quite serious. So again, drop everything, pivot to plan B, and plan B became get to the bottom of this through that 5-step process as quickly as possible. And in so doing, what I discovered is there was lots more going on in the nuclear enterprise that needed to be addressed, and needed to be addressed fairly soon because it had atrophied some over the years. So this initial cheating scandal essentially led me on an investigatory process, which opened my eyes to much broader issues and allowed for us as an Air Force team to put together a plan of attack. We iterated along the way. There was lots of follow-up. And ultimately, I believe a lot of good came from that initial bad, meaning that initial cheating scandal. We changed up the way we train. We changed up the incentives on how people got promoted or not. I think we had the wrong incentives in place, which probably promoted this idea of cheating. It still doesn't make it okay, but it was the wrong incentive. It allowed it to happen. We replaced some leaders. We pumped more money and more manpower into the nuclear organization. And ultimately, we launched the solicitations, the RFPs, which are the first stage of getting the new generation of weapons being built. This is a nuclear enterprise which dates back to the 1960s, and this is a very old system. It needs to be replaced. So everything I just said is some of the good that might not have happened. It might not have happened as quickly had there not been a crisis situation in the very beginning.
So how can leaders kind of learn and grow from these roadblocks in our regular plans along the way?
I think you already said it, Daniel. Learn, evolve, and reinvent. And I already said it earlier about it's really good to have a plan A, but don't be so stuck on that plan A that you're unable to be agile and unable to pivot if for whatever reason plan A no longer makes sense. So the key thing is to have that rapid ability to change your mindset. And by the way, I didn't completely forever throw away my 3 original goals. Once the nuclear enterprise the situation was brought under control, I was able to pivot back because the 3 original goals were quite important as well, but simply not as important in that moment in time. I think leaders also need to have always an optimistic outlook. That doesn't mean rosy colored glasses. It doesn't mean failure to be pragmatic, but it does mean that even when things look bad, this is a good message. I think we're in the middle of a pandemic here. Even when things look bad, a good leader needs to be able to see through some of the fog, see beyond some of the problems, and look for where the opportunities are, and keep the team focused on the optimism, even in the midst of having to deal with a crisis at hand. So I think that's an important thing for good leaders as well.
So when writing your book, was it kind of an enjoyable experience to reflect, or was it stressful seeing that things might have changed now and been in a different scenario than when you left?
It was awful. I'll never do it again. I always say I am a once and done author. It wasn't so awful or stressful because of the things that were happening in the Air Force. There have been a few policy reversals that I, very much disagree with, but it was more stressful because number one, I'd never done it before. Number two, I consider myself to be a good writer, but I hadn't written anything that extensive ever. And I hadn't even done any of my original writing in years. Think about it. As Secretary of the Air Force, you have speech writers, you have people who create your briefing books, who write your point papers for you, et cetera. So it had been years since I had done any of this myself. And suddenly I had to come up with not just a 10-page speech, but a 200-page plus book. So it turned out to be daunting. And there were many, hours that I went through writer's block and tearing my hair out. Why did I get myself into this? But at the end of the day, you power through, you take it in chunks. If you've read the book, I know, it's in 3 sections. So there are lists that you can do to help you get through these things. And it does feel like a sense of an accomplishment now that it's done. And I do enjoy having conversations like this, where I can at least impart whatever wisdom I think I have accumulated in my life to those who are the next generation and coming along behind me.
So you talked a bit about mentorship and how you think that mentorship is so important. How can we all try to find good mentors that can lead us in the right directions in our careers and personal lives and everything like that?
Believe it or not, Daniel, mentors are all around you. They're everywhere. They're everybody from your parents to some of the parents of your friends. They are your teachers. As you get older, they will also be people in the workplace. There could be colleagues, they could be bosses. You've heard me talk about at least one boss who was a fantastic mentor to me, but I have had plenty of them. And particularly as you get into the working environment, you'll find that many large companies today, including some parts of the federal government, they have established mentoring programs. Now, of course, not everybody can get into those programs, but I always advise go on the offense, look into them, and see if you can get yourself included in an established mentor program where you'll be assigned somebody who can advise you along the way. Even if you are in an organization that doesn't have such a program, though, I still advise go on the offense. It can be as easy as asking someone in your environment who you admire to simply have a cup of coffee at their convenience. And please, will you tell me more about your career, your background? I think what you're doing is fascinating, and I'm interested in such a career. It would benefit me greatly if we could have that cup of coffee. And 100% of people won't do it, but you'd be surprised. Most people, if you're patient and willing to do it according to their calendar, they're willing to have that discussion with you. And sometimes that can lead to an ongoing mentoring environment. So ultimately, it's up to the individual to go on the offense. And there are ways to do that even if you don't have a formal program that you can apply to.
So last question, and this is kind of going off of the mentorship and youth leaning into, working with issues they enjoy. How do you think that youth, especially now, and people of all ages really, can be more civically engaged? And in your experience, what's the best way to go about that?
The number one thing you can do, really at all ages, I think, is to read, is to get yourself informed of the major issues of the day that affect you as an individual, your communities, and the world. And there are lots of important issues of the day. They're complicated. And so each of us needs to do a better job of understanding the intricacies of these issues so that we can make informed judgments. The other thing about reading is don't read a single source. Don't read a single book, a single article. Don't always watch a single news channel on television or rely solely on Facebook, but rather look for a variety of reputable sources that have some sort of track record, and also be able to recognize the difference between hard news versus opinion pieces, because there's a lot of both out there, and it sometimes becomes blurred in the minds of people. What is truth versus what's an opinion? Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but in my mind, there are still scientific facts that, are not subject to opinion. So we got to read and understand, and that requires a certain investment of time, and go to reputable sources. The number two thing you can do right after you read and get yourself informed is vote. I mean, that's what we ultimately all have. Those of us who are 18 and above, we have the power to vote. So go out and at a minimum, make sure that you vote. And I'm certainly hopeful that they're going to make voting more accessible in this coming election, particularly through the mail. The number three thing is volunteer. Volunteer for one thing. Pick one thing that interests you, one thing that can give you that purpose, something bigger than yourself, something that contributes to people in a positive way. And volunteer a few hours a month. It could be a few hours a week. It depends on how much time you have, but volunteer. That's another important way to be civic minded.
So that is all the time we have for today. We just want to thank our partners, America's Promise Alliance, Nancy Donahue, and the Greater Lowell Community Foundation for their support. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers. And most importantly, thank you to Secretary James for being with us today and sharing all of your time and knowledge. It's really great.
Thanks, Daniel and Bridget. Appreciate you thinking of me. And thanks again to the leaders in Lowell.